Well, a shocking revelation about the U.S. drone war in Pakistan, according to a new UN report. Nearly one-fifth of all Pakistanis killed by drones over the past decade have been civilians. The interim report from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism says some 2,200 Pakistanis have been killed by U.S. drone strikes over the past decade. I should say. Of those, 18% have been civilians. The report says U.S. drone strikes have killed civilians in Afghanistan and Yemen as well. Well, the interim report was released today, Friday, ahead of an important UN debate on the U.S. drone war in Pakistan. And now the author of that report, Ben Emmerson, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, joins me live from the United Nations. Mr. Emmerson, it's a very busy day for you. I know you've got a panel to go to in just a few minutes, so thank you very much for joining us. So when you look at these figures, 400 of 2,200, which is an estimate because these numbers are secret and very difficult to confirm because of how remote some of these regions are, that's a very large proportion, according to this report, of civilians killed.
Well, I think it's important to realise that, those figures are not static over time. All are agreed that there's been a very significant reduction, not just in the number of strikes, but in the proportion of civilian casualties within the strikes that have occurred during 2012-2013. In other words, they have become less frequent and more accurate as time has gone on. But there clearly was a period between 2008, 2011, when there were very large numbers of civilian casualties in Pakistan.
Now, I know you've requested of the United States to release sort of more details about some of the victims, about some aspects of the operation as well. What is your hope?
Well, look, I'm generally optimistic that the United States is moving it towards greater transparency. The biggest obstacle to transparency so far has been the fact that the covert counterterrorism lethal operations of this kind were under the control to a significant extent of the CIA, which, like any secret organisation anywhere in the world, will neither confirm nor deny its operations. And I think one of the most significant things about the President's 23rd May speech was the commitment to migrate all lethal counterterrorism operations away from CIA and in the direction of DOD. As for transparency, I mean, look, I fall back on the fact that John Brennan, the director of the CIA himself, during his confirmation hearings, recognised, accepted and acknowledged the need for public acknowledgement when there have been civilian casualties. In other words, for transparency about the mistakes that are made. I mean, I take that to be presidential policy. Now, often these things are complex within an administration with as many interests involved as the US administration. But I am certainly optimistic that in the second phase of this inquiry process, because the report today is only an interim report, in the second phase of this inquiry process there will be a degree of cooperation and greater transparency from the United States.
Well, you mentioned the May speech, President Barack Obama there for the first time acknowledging that this drone campaign sometimes essentially kills the wrong people and civilians are victims. Do you accept some of the criticism coming from those who think this drone campaign is essentially counterproductive? In other words, that it fuels so much resentment in target countries and even beyond, that it serves as a recruiting tool for terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda? Or do you think that it has some merit?
Well, look, these things are impossible to quantify, and I've certainly been looking very closely at the evidence on both sides of the debate. There are those who suggest, and the Pakistani government is one of them, that the continued use of drone strikes is inhibiting any kind of peaceful resolution within the Fatah area, and that every time there's a drone strike, there will be a lethal retaliatory strike against Pakistani nationals, whether military or civilian. In other words, that it carries with it the momentum for the perpetuation of violent extremism. Against that is the argument that Al-Qaeda Central, if I can use that shorthand, has undoubtedly been significantly degraded over the past few years. And there are those who are urging this administration privately to reach a point where they no longer invoke the doctrine of armed conflict to justify their extraterritorial counterterrorism operations. And obviously we've seen in those two recent examples in Libya and Somalia a determination apparently to arrest rather than to eliminate.
Right. I was gonna ask you about that. Should that be, because I spoke with Ken Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, and I brought up those two raids, the capture in Libya as well as the operation that failed ultimately in Somalia to capture an al-Shabaab, I should say, militant. Do you, as the special rapporteur on counterterrorism, do you think that should be the way to go for the United States when it can identify a specific threat against its interests?
Well, look. International law requires that if an enemy combatant is capable of being arrested and detained, then that is the route that should be taken rather than the use of lethal force. That is part of the International Committee of the Red Cross's guidelines on what they call direct participation in hostility. So it's a principle of law. But it is also, as we know, reflected in the presidential policy guidance. That where it is possible to arrest and detain, then lethal force will not be used. I mean, there may be lots of debates about the circumstances which bear on the feasibility of capture, but certainly outside areas of active hostilities, the US policy currently is to capture where feasible.